Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this strange day. The light is coming back here. I woke up this morning, the day was orange, the fog was orange. And I sat and someone called me and said, "The sky's black." This was 2 hours later. And now it's turning orange again. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. On Monday nights, I participate in a kind of small Zen group made up of senior people who bounce around ideas and talk and keep ourselves on track. And my friend and one of the members, Tony Head, brought this wonderful poem by a Japanese poet. And it's so simple, and yet it has such deep implications that I wanted to talk about it today. It comes from a book by Gary Snyder called Danger on the Peaks. It's a wonderful book. I consider Gary my first teacher, the first person I'd ever known who actually lived like a Zen practitioner. And so I read quite often. So here's the story. There was a poet, Japanese poet named Issa, who was fated to lose 4 of his children. And on the death of his 2-year-old, I think it was a daughter, he wrote the following little haiku, which says, "This dewdrop world is but a dewdrop world, and yet. This dewdrop world is but a dewdrop world, and yet." And Gary Snyder says that "and yet" is our perennial practice and maybe the root of the Dharma. So we all know what a dewdrop is. We've all seen dew on the grass. It's there for a little bit till it's warmed by the sun and it disappears. And so the fundamental insight of Buddhism has to do with impermanence and change. Everything is changing. Everything is impermanent. And there's a danger that that sense of impermanence, that sense of the world being soap, the things of the world being permanent, can lead us to a kind of realism. The reason that most religions cloak their transcendental insights in deep ethical and moral concerns, because that insight is not enough. Just seeing things as permanent. We can't dismiss reality, or what we call reality, where things appear separate and solid. That's our agreement on what reality is. I'm in here, you're out there. I have a self which is separate and discrete from everything else. And the 10,000 things that the Chinese refer to as the world out there. That's kind of the human agreement. That's the way the world is received by our sense organs and translated by our brain and by our culture. We're taught how to see the world, and we learn to see the world the way we're taught. Look at the birdie. Look at the tree. Look at the grass. Cheeks. Come to mommy. Come to daddy. And there's a certain point in our development where we can run the film as an unbroken event. And from that point, we are initiated into the culture. And we're initiated into the long skein of human history. But the Buddha pointed out that this is kind of a fundamental illusion. I've said this many times. I'll probably never stop saying it because it's the point of Buddhist teaching. But when you look deeply you can see that nothing stands alone. I couldn't be here without oxygen. I couldn't be here without water. I couldn't be here without sunlight. I couldn't be here without microbes in the soil nourishing my food. I couldn't be here without pollinating insects. I couldn't be here without birds controlling the pollinating insects. I couldn't be here without the people who planted, harvested, milled, spun, wove, sewed the cotton that I'm wearing. You can take it all the way out to the Earth's place in the solar system and beyond. If we were closer to the sun, water would boil off. If we were farther away, it would freeze. We wouldn't be here. So the reality is that there's one thing. Buddhism's not a duality. We don't talk about good and evil. There's one thing. And if anything's sacred, it's that one thing. It's all of it. And of course, you can destroy anything but all of it. Everything comes and goes, but all of it. And yet, I love that statement, and yet you can't live in that reality. You can't live in enlightenment. In his new book called Changing Your Mind, I'm blocking the name of the author. He wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma. He's a wonderful writer on food. It'll come to me. Someone will help me. In this book on psychedelics and the insight derived from psychedelics and a new interest in psychedelics as a therapeutic tool, he discusses a section of the brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network is what keeps us from being high all the time. It keeps us focused on the agreed upon description of reality. If our ancestors had been so spaced out looking at a luminous blue butterfly, they might not have been paying attention to saber-toothed tigers. So our normal waking consciousness is held by this area of the brain. But curiously enough, this area of the brain is relaxed by psychedelics and by meditating. And when that happens, different neural connections are made, and we're allowed to go beyond the boundaries of our personality. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Maybe not. So the and yet reminds us that we can't exist in an enlightened state perennially. Enlightenment is a verb. It's not a territory. We don't climb a fence and suddenly just on the other side as a bliss ninny cranking out wisdom and perfect behavior because we've had this one experience. Doesn't work that way. When we behave as an enlightened person, when we remember the oneness, and when we act on it, we're acting in an enlightened way. When we follow the Eightfold Path, we're acting in an enlightened way. When we don't, we're just another bozo on the bus. A Zen master who's not paying attention is just another bozo on the bus. A Zen master who uses the Dharma as a merit badge, an aid to seduction, whatever. It's just another bozo on the bus. This dewdrop world is where we live. So this comes up, Gary brings this up in a chapter called After Bamiyan. And I don't know if you remember, in 2001, the Taliban took weeks to blow up these 200-foot tall statues of Buddha that had been carved into a cliff face. They date from the 5th century. And the word is that it actually took, somewhere in my notes, Anyway, it took probably centuries to build. They were carved out of the rock, and mud and straw was put together to sculpt a head and fine features, and it was covered with stucco. Beautiful figures were made. One was 115 feet tall, the other was 174 feet tall. One was painted, the largest one was painted once carmine red, the smaller one was multicolored, and they were described by travelers back to the 6th century. They were kind of World Heritage Sites. Well, in March 2001, the Taliban declared them idols and declared that under Islamic law they had to destroy them. You know, in Muslim countries there are no representations of people. That's why the script is so beautiful, the calligraphy is so beautiful. That's why the architecture is so ornate. It's not art per se. No idols. There's actually a complicated story about it. Supposedly it was Osama bin Laden that gave the order to destroy them, and his lieutenant, Mullah Omar, thought it was a bad idea, thought that they should protect it as a tourist site, get money from it, children run the charities, support their causes. But at a certain point, when they threatened to destroy the statues, there was such an outcry from the world. Almost every country in the world offered to buy the statues, pay to have them covered and taken care of, demanded that they be recognized as a World Heritage Site. And Muhammad Omar was furious. He said, "You're willing to spend money for statues, but Afghan people are dying of starvation. Our children are ill. Where's the money for them?" And he also rejected the globalizing concept of a cultural heritage. Like human beings had common interests and common history that they might want to acknowledge. And so they set about and they destroyed these statues, and it took weeks. They had to drill in them and dynamite them and shoot mortars into them. It went on and on and on and on. And a Chinese couple recently, a couple of years ago, have paid to create a holographic representation in that space so that they can project a hologram of what they were. Anyway, needless to say, they were destroyed. And there was a lot of controversy in the West about their destruction. What Gary said about it is interesting. Last week they were blown up by the Taliban. Not just by the Taliban, but by woman and nature-denying authoritarian worldviews that go back much farther than Abraham. It's worth repeating. Not just by the Taliban, but by woman and nature-denying authoritarian worldviews that go back much farther than Abraham. And then he makes a little clear, may we keep our minds clear and calm in the present moment and honor the dust. Well, there were a number of people that thought it was sentimental to care about these statues. A Buddhist scholar wrote to Gary and he said, yes, but the manifest Dharma is intrasamsaric, whatever that means, and will decay. So Westerners, Buddhist scholars, practitioners of Buddhism are saying nothing lasts. Well, we know that nothing lasts. The older I get, the more I'm reminded that nothing lasts. But this is where Issa's "and yet" comes in. And yet, because the impermanence is all we have. And if we deny it, We literally have nothing. There's a school of psychology called family systems. It's actually pretty interesting. When I was in my priest training, we studied this pretty much in depth. And it stands in resistance to Freud's idea of a trinity inside us, an ego, an id, and a superego. You know, the ego is our sense of self. The id is our mediated willful impulses for pleasure and anger, greed, hate, and delusion. And then the superego represents the abiding legal constructions of society that, you know, keeps us on a leash. Most of them. Family systems posited that we have many, many voices inside us. And they have these really interesting games where you kind of draw a circle which represents a table. And you pull these voices out of yourself. You recognize them, you name them, you know, whining William, angry Adam, you know, sad Sally. And it's amazing, when you start looking, you'll see them. You'll see these internal dialogues. You'll see these ongoing things, and they encourage you to welcome them. In many cases, to say, you know, thank you for struggling so much on my behalf, because the supposition is that all these voices were created to help you at some time when you were too little and this was all you had. So you thank them. Thank you so much for fighting on my behalf all these years. But you know something? I'm in the now, and you can relax. I'll take the weight. I can do it. I have the tools to protect myself. And so you bring these orphaned voices into the present. You let them speak. You encourage them to speak. And in so doing, you map your inner geography in a more nuanced way than just ego, id, and superego. And sometimes you'll find thoughts or feelings that were too frightening, and so you created imposters. You created voices to protect you from getting at the real voice. Anyway, one of the founders and teachers of that school of thought was a man named John Wellwood, who's really worth reading. And he came up with a term called spiritual bypassing. And spiritual bypassing is the pretense that we're too enlightened to have any feelings. You know, your wife is screaming at you because you forgot to pick up the kids, and you're just saying, well, yes, it was a mistake, and I'm not angry, I'm not anything. In fact, I'm feeling so nothing, I'm dead. That's spiritual bypassing. Emotions are real. It's not that they should always be expressed, but neither should they be denied. And it becomes the social neurosis of some spiritual communities to deny them, to suggest that any display of emotion is a less enlightened state. He gets angry. And yet, teachers like Trungpa were drunk out of their gourds and still teaching the Dharma. Many Zen teachers, Leonard Cohen's teacher. Anyway, he was banished from Japan as a thief. He's a great teacher. There have been alcoholics, there have been all sorts of roustabouts and roundabouts, but they still understood the Dharma and they could transmit it. And they had the same personal struggles that you and I will always have, even after enlightenment. Because it doesn't end our karma. It just allows us to express it in a bigger field and to be aware that we have it and we're struggling with it. So spiritual bypassing, here's an example of spiritual bypassing. So someone wrote to Gary about the statues and said, and Gary says, a person who should know better wrote, many credulous and sensitive Westerners, I suspect, were upset by the destruction of the Afghan Buddha figures because they believe that the so-called Eastern religion is more tender-hearted and less dogmatic. So is nothing sacred? Only respect for human life and culture, which requires no divine sanction and no priesthood to inculcate it. The foolish veneration of holy places and holy texts remains a principal obstacle to that simple realization. This guy's up in the stratosphere, and he has a completely intellectual, clear, lucid, enlightened, untroubled view of the world. Gary gets him. This is Gary's response to him. This is another case of blame the victim. Buddhism is not on trial here. The Bamiyan statues are part of human life and culture. They are works of art being destroyed by idolaters of the book. Is there anything credulous in respect to art and religious culture of the past? Counting on the tender-heartedness of most Buddhists, you can feel safe in trashing the Bamiyan figures as though the Taliban wasn't doing a good enough job. I doubt you would have the nerve to call for launching a little missile at the Kaaba, the heart of Islam, the temple where Muhammad's remains are stored. There are people who would put a hit on you for that, and you know it. So the point of that is, yes, impermanence, but it's never an excuse to let your compassion evaporate, to let your sense of kindness evaporate, just because things are impermanent. Is Issa's and yet. Yes, we're not artificial flowers, we're real flowers. And we treasure them because they're dying, because they're passing. And if we're alert, we'll treasure everything like that. We'll treasure other people like that, because everything's going. But what does that really mean? That means this is the nature of reality. When we see impermanence, we are seeing the world, we are seeing things as it is, as Suzuki Roshi used to say. It was not a grammatical mistake. Things as it is, because it is one thing. It's got millions of things on it, like ticks on a dog, but it's one thing. So it's really important in our sense of practice to remember that impermanence does not stop us from being kind. Impermanence does not stop us from being studious. Impermanence does not stop us from treasuring the beautiful and expressions of mind and culture of ages past. Impermanence does not stop us from sweeping the street in front of our house, washing our windows, helping the homeless. It's just like the earth itself is in motion, and everything on it is in motion. So we don't notice it. Well, everything is impermanent. It's not a neurotic state. The idea that you can stand outside of impermanence is a mental. There is no place to stand outside of impermanence. This is it. This is the and yet. And yet. Yes, all of our spiritual wisdom, all of our insights, all of our wisdom, all of our kind, luminous, gentle, spiritual practices going. So the real thing is, how do we exist in this transient world? What are the intentions we hold fast to? What are the practices we hold fast to? And Buddha's expression of the Eightfold Path was the clearest, simple blueprint of an enlightened life. beginning with the view that everything is impermanent. And based on that, right livelihood, right speech, right effort. So, I think because people who think carelessly are part of the mix, they're like the spice in the stew, it's very easy to take Buddhist insight and turn it into a kind of nihilism, kind of sociopathy. Because probably your life's much simpler on some level if you have no empathy, if you have no feelings, if you're never torn by doubt, if you never have to wrestle with conflicting impulses and ideas. And the idea of always living in the eye of the storm, untroubled by anything, is compelling. And when you've sat Zazen for a number of years, and when you've read a lot of Buddhism, and when you've talked to a lot of people, you can get a pretty Lama Lama. Oh yes, I'm above it. Mm-hmm. Yes, that poor person is on fire. What an interesting phenomenon. But that very perception separates you from the rest of it. It's almost like magical thinking. If I can stay untroubled, well, maybe I won't age. Maybe I won't be moving toward death. If I can stay perfectly calm, maybe I won't get wrinkles on my face. Maybe I won't get wattles on my neck. So at its root, it's a kind of self-centered thinking. As my teacher, Lewis Richmond, once said to me, we were discussing spiritual experiences and kenshos and enlightenment and stuff, and he said, listen, if you're not kind and helpful to people, who cares what kind of spiritual experience you had? Right? Who cares? Who knows? The purpose is to be kind, to treasure existence, to treasure this dewdrop world, to do as little harm as you can, to take care of as much as you can, to treasure a housefly, to treasure, I laugh at myself, but I keep a plastic cup and a piece of paper, and I'm always capturing flies and sending them out of my house, or spiders, sending them out of my house. They don't want to be here. I don't like finding them in my windowsills, dead, having pressed against the screens. There's a religion, the Jains, Jains, and these people walk with a jangling staff to warn ants and snakes and bugs out of their path, and they carry little nets to rescue insects out of pools of water, things like that. To extend kindness, to extend the understanding that everything wants to live. A bee struggling in water to get out is using every ounce of its energy to live. So when you put your finger in and you lift it out, they shake their wings off and they wiggle their butt a little bit and they dry off and they fly away. I don't know if they feel gratitude or if they feel luck or if they feel anything, but I feel some tenderness toward that bee. I feel some connection to that bee. And that tenderness makes the world comprehensible. That tenderness toward plants, toward animals, toward soil, toward rock, which supports lichen. If rocks were not alive in some unknown, unimaginable capacity to us, how could they support living lichen? They support entities. So, from my understanding, it's not even an understanding, it's probably my own mental pet. I treat everything as alive. I walk rocks in my garden because they have moss, they have things on. So I water the rocks and I talk to them and we have relationships. Who's to say? Who's to say whether it's crazy or not? Doesn't hurt anything. Might help. And it takes me away from the sense of myself being all important, which is a much nicer way to navigate. See, 10:38. Maybe there's some questions. Oh, people are discussing politics on the website. I wish you wouldn't. It doesn't matter if George Bush was smart or Donald Trump. Let's leave. Let's talk about that outside. Let's see what people are saying. Anyone else's pets outright? Michael Pollan, thank you so much. I have a blurb on his book. Michael Pollan is the man that wrote Changing Your Mind and The Omnivore's Dilemma. Very brilliant writer. And this book on psychedelics is well worth reading. I don't want to talk about Charles Manson. No, he didn't hang out with the diggers. Yes. So what about the unseeable live things? My friend Leslie Bacon says, the microbes in our body, the infections and the parasites. Should we not take medicine to kill them? What do the Jains do about medicine? That's a great question. So I think everything will live. And I think in the course of living, we inevitably do harm to other species. The question is not to do undue harm. So I think when we're sick, we take medicine. If I find a scorpion in the house, I take the scorpion outside. I don't think we have to feel bad about wanting to live. I think it's the wanting to live that keeps the machinery moving. We're not ending all parasites. We're ending those parasites that are a threat to us. And anything that was a threat to us, a tree growing over our house, we might cut the tree down. It's impossible to live without doing some harm. Just impossible. We couldn't use toilet paper. We couldn't write on paper. There's nothing we can do that doesn't cost something to some other creature. And we're going to be cost. At some point, the viruses are going to win. At some point, the malefactors after my body are going to win and they're going to get it. But that doesn't mean I have to deny myself the struggle to be here. They're struggling, I'm struggling. We're equal. I don't hate them. I don't consider them evil. I just consider them life trying to express itself, like the pandemic. Is opportunistic to some degree. We have the capacity to diminish the number of times we need to be opportunistic. I mean, it makes me a little crazy. It was, the other day, it was 113 degrees where I live. It's never been like that in the life of anyone who's lived in Sebastopol. None of my neighbors had ever seen anything like it. It was 109, it was 104 in the shade. And I look at that and then I turn on the television and I see they're still selling 400 horsepower cars. And people, take your life in your hands, be all you can be, have an adventure. And in the midst of the pandemic and the political campaign, there's not a word mentioned about global warming. One of my neighbors is drilling a well. And I was talking to the well driller this morning when I was walking my dogs. I asked him how deep he was down. They were down 480 feet. My well, which was done about 25 years ago, is about 280 feet. And I said, wow, what's going on? He said, well, the aquifers are shrinking. The water table is dropping. There's a lot of people. And I'm thinking one of my neighbors is watering his lawn every day, every morning, 365 days a year. And the well driller said, you know, these aquifers don't get refilled by the rain. They don't get filled up. When they're empty, they're empty. And I remembered something I read about the aquifer under Phoenix. Goes from something like Phoenix to Denver. And the town fathers were planning to empty it out within 50 years. And I read this about 20 years ago. So one way or another, we come face to face with impermanence. We can't escape it. So the and yet is embrace it. Fearless, clear-eyed, do what we can. Compassion and kindness, because the world is literally us. If I'm made of sunshine, if I'm made of microbes in the soil, if I'm made of water, if I'm made of your efforts, everything, I don't want to say is me, but I'm all of it. So the idea of separating myself from it by being unkind, by giving you the finger when you startle me and cut me off when you're driving, it's just ignorant. I want to read this again. This dewdrop world is but a dewdrop world. It means it's nothing, it's ephemeral, that but. And yet. And Gary reminds us that this and yet is our perennial practice. And I'm hoping to remind any one of you that might have forgotten it or might have thought that there is a place to stand outside of change, outside of impermanence. There isn't. This is it. It's like being in a kayak going down the canyon. You can't control the Colorado River, but you can learn to work with it. You can develop your skills, your balance, your resilience, your patience. These are the tools we need to live successfully. Let's see. Somebody, I feel better now about having to recently remove a tree from my garden. Good. Biologist Eric Clark writes, biologists say that the surface of the earth is a toilet and a graveyard. And he observes, but it's also a nursery. Those are the limits of science. Okay. I'm going to say my little prayer. I'm sure everybody's got a big day. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. I'll tell you what my plan is. My friend and student, Judith Gilbert, transcribes all of these Dharma talks, and then I edit them. Actually, I hope to put together a book called Vernacular Buddhism, a way of translating Buddhism into an American vernacular. So you can tell me how I'm doing. If I get too off center, please tell me, because without my Sangha, it's really easy to get lost. So if I'm talking over your head, if I'm using too many foreign terms, if it's not clear, please tell me. You can go to SF Zen Dog. What is my address? Wait a minute. I'm going to disappear you for a second because I can't remember my address, but I will be back. Oh yeah. It is sfzencoyote@gmail.com. That's where I correspond about Buddhist issues. SF, like San Francisco, zencoyote@gmail.com. Anyway, I'll say the metta prayer. You can say it with me if you like, and I'll see you next week. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. Please be good to yourselves, good to each other,